Nora Douglas Holt was a lot of things.
She led a very spicy existence.
A Kansas Citian, an accomplished pianist, composer, singer, and music critic.
With deep appreciation and best wishes,
Here she is in 1953, hosting a radio show.
Negro musicians of the New York area join artists and composers of America in saluting the city-owned WNYC broadcasting station.
Nora's days were filled with deeply intellectual pursuits, writing symphonies, publishing magazines. Then at night, she'd party with Langston Hughes and club hop with Josephine Baker.
She knew people would talk about her, and she didn't really care.
She composed more than 200 musical pieces, but you've probably never heard any of them. In fact, almost nobody has heard her music.
There's a lot of mystery about her, and this is maybe the biggest mystery.
There wasn't really anyone to collect in terms of her life. We're left with these fragments, and I'm, as a historian, trying to piece together these wildly different aspects of her personality.
I'm Mackenzie Martin, and on this episode of A People's History of Kansas City, the story of Nora Holt. She's been called the most famous woman you've never heard of. All these years after her death, we're still trying to figure her out. One of the first things I learned about Nora Holt is that there's an air of mystery around pretty much every element of her life. She's known by about a dozen different names, and the way she came into this world is murky too. Most people think Nora Holt was born around 1885, but that's about the only thing we can agree on.
Kansas City, Missouri seems to be the consensus among scholars, although she said Kansas City, Kansas sometimes, and not other times.
This is my colleague, senior producer Sam Wisman, who's been researching and interviewing people about Nora Holt for KCUR's sister station, 91.9 Classical KC, where you can hear locally focused classical music 24/7. Sam's the one who told me these mysteries around Nora Holt's life, yeah, they're not an accident. She purposefully created this mystique.
She seemed to be constantly reinventing herself. She would kind of morph depending on the circle she was running in. I'm not trying to say that she wasn't being honest, but she could run in lots of different circles. And I talked about this with the author of Southside Impresarios, a new book about the Black women who transformed Chicago's classical music scene.
Hello, my name is Dr. Samantha Ege. I am a music historian and concert pianist.
And Samantha is sort of the world's foremost expert on Nora Holt.
She enjoyed the fictions of her life, and she enjoyed what she could put out there to fit certain narratives and sort of, create this aura about her.
She could hang at the opera house and be this sort of educated music critic person, and then also hang at the Harlem Renaissance party.
Born Lena Douglas, Nora Holt grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, in a Black middle-class family. Her parents were really passionate about education and music and instilled that in Nora.
Her father was a very respected reverend on the national stage, essentially. Her mother was definitely a paragon of race womanhood.
Nora's father, Calvin Douglas, was a minister at the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And Nora's mother, Gracie Brown Douglas, started teaching her piano at age 4. Eventually, Nora became the organist for her father's church.
When her father would travel the country trying to raise money for his church, Nora Holt would go with him, and she would give these recitals. She was incredibly accomplished. There is something about her that just seems so free-spirited. This sort of hints at a child that was incredibly driven and creative and deeply imaginative.
In the 1910s, Nora enrolled in Western University, the first historically Black college west of the Mississippi. Sadly, it's long gone today, other than a remaining cornerstone or two. It was part of the former Quindaro settlement, located on a bluff in Kansas, just across the Missouri River. What's left of the settlement now looks like an archaeological dig site, but in its day, Quindaro was an incredibly important place.
I mean, it was an essential stop on the Underground Railroad, and then it was a early Black community in this part of the country.
Western University's music school started in Quindaro in 1903, and under the direction of music educators like Robert Jackson, who founded the Jackson Jubilee Singers, the program became one of the best in the country.
It was like a real hub for creativity and education for Black people in the Midwest. Many great musicians went through there.
Yes, including Kansas City's raunchy blues queen, Julia Lee, who we did an entire episode about that people should really listen to. So how did Nora do at Western University? Did she like it there?
She seemed to thrive at Western University. She was valedictorian.
Before going to college, at just 15 years old, Nora Holt got married to a fellow musician named Sky James. And once she got to college, she faced intense pressure to conform to a certain way of life.
My understanding is that for women, these institutions were something of a finishing school. And so you're not just being trained academically, but you're being trained to participate in society in a certain way. And I think for women, particularly, the expectation was marriage and motherhood.
But Nora Holt wasn't really into all that. Her first marriage didn't stick. And for one reason or another, none of her other marriages did either. So how many times was she married?
5. She wanted to be a professional. She wanted to kind of make her own way and not just be a homebody.
And that all started with making a name for herself at Western University.
You know, at this time period, jazz is starting to become more of a thing. And ragtime as well.
But to be clear, those styles of music weren't necessarily embraced at Western University.
Western University and a lot of historically Black colleges and universities had these music programs, but oftentimes ragtime, jazz, the blues were banned. These styles were seen as sort of low culture. They were seen as something that these respectable race men and women should not associate with.
Of course, Nora Holt couldn't have cared less about this. Her taste in music, like her life, was eclectic and unpredictable.
Nora Holt really strikes me as a rebel because she begins to actually embrace these styles that were so strongly discouraged.
As far as I have learned, Nora Holt loved ragtime, but was not a fan of jazz music.
Nora's feelings on jazz seemed to change later on, but initially she called it America's enfant terrible.
A lot of Black musicians at this time, they were prevented from entering classical music spaces. And they were told, well, but you can do jazz, you can do ragtime. And she was like, no, I have a classical music training and I want to do this music. I'm not even that into jazz music. I don't really like it. So don't tell me that I can't create this music and participate in classical music.
I love how passionate she was about music and how she really forged her own path. And she continued to study music after graduating from Western University, right?
Yeah, so she went to the Chicago Musical College.
She pursues a Master of Music and becomes the first Black person in the whole of the United States to earn a Master of Music degree.
Wow.
Her thesis composition is a piece called A Rhapsody on Negro Themes, and it's for a 100-piece orchestra. So it's really interesting because in my work as a Florence Price scholar, I often see the banner, Florence Price, the first woman to write a symphony, which takes place in 1932. But actually, Nora Holt is already writing symphonically in 1918, which suggests that this is something Black women have been doing for a while.
It's also really interesting to me how good she was at building these big communities, especially during her time in Chicago.
Yeah, so while she was in Chicago, she formed the National Association of Negro Musicians and the Chicago Music Association. These were groups that brought musicians together, Black musicians together, to exchange ideas, exchange contacts, help each other get gigs.
It's important to note that this was all happening in 1919, when racial tension was particularly high in Chicago and the country.
The riots that broke out in the summer of 1919 were the bloodiest and the largest that the nation had ever seen. One needs only to remember two of them, the great riot in the city of Washington and the one in the city of Chicago.
The National Association of Negro Musicians held its first convention that July, in the midst of major unrest and violence.
In the summer of 1919, it was called the Red Summer. Black people, they had to resist tremendous waves of white terror.
To be so public about advocating for their presence in a space, the classical music world, that is so white, it's bold and it takes a lot of courage.
Yeah. And that's not all she did either. Another really big way she advocated for Black musicians was through her writing.
Yes, she was writing in the Chicago Defender.
The Chicago Defender was the most influential Black newspaper of its day. And even within that publication, she was shaking things up. Nora's column was the first regular feature in a Black newspaper dedicated exclusively to classical music.
This is a chapter of Nora's life that I talked about extensively with Lucy Kaplan.
Hi, I'm Lucy Kaplan. I'm an assistant professor of music at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Lucy is the author of the soon-to-be-published book, Dreaming in Ensemble, How Black Artists Transformed American Opera.
I was just taken in by this woman who seemed so curious, so inquisitive, so smart in the way that she wrote about music. Who was this African-American woman writing about classical music in Chicago in 1917?
So here's a little bit of her describing the scene at a Chicago opera performance. Amber lights accentuated by gold settings, greens and blues of peacocks, listless, tip-tilted and defiant, murmuring voices, Schoenbergian in nuances and dissonances.
She would write really beautifully about what she heard, whether that was a singer or the opera or the symphony or a pianist. But she would also write really beautifully about what it was like to go to a concert, how she felt, what she wore, what other people were wearing.
Nora was incredibly ahead of her time. I mean, this was the Jim Crow era. The Civil Rights Act banning discrimination on the basis of race and sex wouldn't be passed for another 47 years.
In most cases, Black people weren't allowed to go to these concerts. She might have been able to go, but it's not like large groups of Black people were going to see the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. So by writing these reviews in the Chicago Defender and being so descriptive in her writing, she is almost bringing the Black population along to a concert that they otherwise couldn't go to.
Nora also wrote about classical music in a way that made it more accessible. She'd acknowledge some of the stuffiness involved and encourage people to give it a try anyway.
I work for a classical music station. Classical music has this rap of being exclusive or only for the elite. But that is not really the whole story of classical music. I mean, it really was a music for the people in many cases. It was either for the people or for the church, typically. And Nora Holt, in her writing and her advocacy, is trying to remind people of that. This music is for you. Just because, you know, the great composers are these white men with white wigs, it doesn't mean it's not for you. And it doesn't mean that you aren't allowed to participate in it as an audience member or a creator.
I love that sentiment. So we've talked about her articles in The Defender, but we haven't yet discussed her magazine, which was called Music and Poetry. And what I really like about the magazine is that where the Chicago Defender was mostly staffed by men, this magazine was kind of like a Black feminist icon that a lot of people read.
I mean, again, if this was all Nora Holt did, if this was the entirety of Nora Holt's legacy, music and poetry, that would be enough to cover her in a podcast like this, in my opinion.
Music and Poetry was a monthly magazine that embodied Nora's personal mission of pushing back against white supremacy and advocating for Black musicians. It sold for 25 cents in cities like Chicago, Tuskegee, Boston, Montgomery, Washington. In 1921, Nora wrote, "Of course, men are supposed to have better business minds than women. But I have made this thing go, and the opportunities are yet unlimited."
One of my favorite things she has in the magazine is what's called the Musician's Creed. And it's a little like advertisement kind of that's a pledge to perform music by Black composers on every concert program. And, you know, I think we think of diversifying classical music as such a recent development, but here she was 100 years ago.
The magazine was financed by Nora's then-husband, George Holt, who was this wealthy hotel and theater owner, heavily involved in the Chicago cabaret and speakeasy scene.
He bought her a massive house, which had a beautiful grand piano.
This is Samantha Ege again.
And so her home became this salon, basically, you know, this intellectual and creative hub.
It's also worth noting that while Nora Holt had 5 marriages and multiple names in her lifetime, Lena Douglas, Nora Ray, it was her marriage to George Holt that gave her the name that has stuck the most, though it's unclear why.
I don't know why she seemed to settle on Nora Holt. Maybe she didn't even settle on Nora Holt. Maybe the media settled on Nora Holt.
Maybe it was a good stage name. Maybe it looked good on the playbill.
I think she enjoyed almost messing with people a little bit with who she was as a person, especially at this point in her life.
Nora Holt definitely had this side that was quite adventurous, quite unafraid to be kind of maybe a little bit exhibitionist in how she approached the world. And I think that was an essential part of who she was. Her life was often in the gossip columns of these newspapers. And my sense is that she knew people would talk about her and she didn't really care.
Nora was in her mid-30s around this time, but George was in his mid-60s. And in 1921, he died, leaving her a sizable fortune to do with what she wanted. And with that, Nora again reinvented herself. This time in New York City. It was the Roaring 20s, and New York was in the midst of its own intellectual and cultural movement, the Harlem Renaissance, a golden era of Black literature, music, art, and culture. Nora fit right in, and she started befriending jazz musicians and luminaries like poet Langston Hughes.
What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?
It's interesting reading through letters of correspondence with Langston Hughes and Gertrude Stein as well, where they're talking about how she's such an exciting person. You have to meet her. You know, she's brilliant. She's fabulous.
She was a treasured party guest who was totally uninhibited.
Well, I have seen her nudes, so I can, attest to that probably being true. These parties were places for the sexually liberated. She felt very at home in those circles. She felt very at home in queer spaces, which leads me to speculate about sort of the fluidity of her own sexuality. And what's interesting is that she didn't hide any of that. It shows a completely different side to her because we know her as this erudite, scholarly composer, music theorist, etc. But she's also quite comfortable with getting her top off for her friends. So.
Nora was the kind of person who was always looking for the next thing. Of course, it was happening in New York, but it was also happening in a lot of other places, like Paris, where she lived in 1926, when she was about 40.
She decided to dye her hair blonde and pass herself off as this Creole jazz singer in Paris.
Paris is also where Nora rediscovered her love of classical composition.
Her time in Paris is kind of this dual existence because she goes to study with Nadia Boulanger, who is sort of like a Yoda figure in classical music composition pedagogy.
So she's doing that by day, but then at night she's living this sort of jazz goddess kind of existence. So she's sort of rotating these different identities.
Nora's travels weren't solely fueled by this exciting pull to explore the world, though. There was also a push away from a country whose racist systems made it hard to succeed as a Black artist. Lucy Kaplan told Sam that tons of Black artists and intellectuals during this time, frustrated with Jim Crow and racism in America, left the U.S. just to see what else was out there.
And they found that, no place was perfect and no place was free from racism, but there were other options. There were different ways of moving through the world.
Paris was good to Nora. Samantha Ege says she teasingly described herself to the Black press as naughty little Nora. At the time, she was doing a lot of club hopping with people like Josephine Baker, who, if you didn't know, is a famous dancer, actress, and singer born in St. Louis.
Must I go or must I stay? Will my skies be blue or gray?
I mean, to be a fly on the wall and follow the two of them around Paris, what fabulous nights they must have had together.
Everything seemed to be working out. That is until...
She's making the right moves to be a successful classical composer. And then it just stopped. It just stopped.
On one of those nights when Nora was adventuring around Paris, perhaps while she was singing in a nightclub with her signature blonde hair, or maybe while she was seated at Nadia Boulanger's all-powerful piano, somebody back in Chicago was breaking into a storage space. Nora's storage space. And not to be too dramatic here, but it completely changed the direction of Nora Holt's life.
Hey, it's Suzanne Hogan. Hope you're enjoying the story about the incredible Nora Holt. It's actually the second part of a collaboration we've been doing with Classical KC, highlighting underrepresented composers and musicians from the Kansas City area. If you haven't yet, make sure to listen to the episode we did about Dana Suisse, too. And if I'm being real with you, I listen to 91.9 Classical KC all the time. I find a lot of inspiration from classical music. It's the perfect backdrop for when I want to break from the news and I just want to chill, cook dinner, unwind with a book, or get ready in the morning to tackle the day. You can listen online at classicalkc.org anytime, or if you're in the local Kansas City area, tune in to 91.9 Classical KC. Classical music for everyone.
I didn't know Nora Holt, but I don't think her Chicago storage space was something on her mind when she was roaming European cities in the 1920s. That is, until the time she returned home from Paris and made a unique discovery.
Somebody broke in.
She came back and she found that her things had been ransacked, and that unfortunately included more than 200 compositions.
She called it the great tragedy of her life. And all these years later, the compositions have still never been found, which means all of Nora's works, compositions she labored over for decades, the college thesis she wrote for a 100-piece orchestra, they're all gone. Or if they are out there, we don't know where they are. Thankfully, Nora Holt did publish 2 of her compositions in her magazine, so we do have access to those pieces. And of those 2, one has actually been recorded. By Samantha Ege, in fact. This is Negro Dance.
It's really short, it's really fast, it's energetic. It just shows the promise of what could have been.
How do you personally feel about Nora Holt's missing music?
It's heartbreaking to write that much music and to have it just be gone. It's not as if there's some hard drive backup for this. I mean, she had to write this out by hand on manuscript paper. There are layers to this tragedy because someone like Beethoven, his music, we only know because it was written on paper and people could play it. Therefore, Beethoven's music can influence other musicians and influence the world. And so not only was Nora Holt's music gone, we lost this positive ripple effect of her music influencing other musicians.
These days, to steal someone's entire life's work, you have to be a pretty good hacker. You need to figure out a bunch of passwords, sift through the internet, maybe steal a hard drive or 2. But all that stood between this thief and Nora's life's work was maybe a lock on a storage space?
The truth is nobody really knows what happened. There's the boring way to look at it, which is just some random people broke into a random storage unit and stole some stuff. The more exciting way to think about it is that there's a little more intrigue there.
This was naturally a very popular topic of speculation while Sam was doing his interviews.
I don't know if she was targeted or not. She was a fodder for gossip columns and she was kind of a dramatic person, but I don't think she necessarily had a lot of enemies.
Well, except for one potential enemy.
Now, I want to put something out there. It was also during this time that she was going through a very public divorce.
Okay, so prior to her time abroad, Nora Holt married Joseph Ray, a secretary of steel magnate Charles Schwab. Joseph was this wealthy, traditional guy, and he really wanted Nora to be his wealthy, traditional wife. But as you probably already know, that is not how things went.
I mean, I don't think was ever gonna be the traditional wife to any man.
Nora briefly moved to Pennsylvania for Joseph, but he wanted her to stay home and take care of his kids, which Nora was not into. Their marriage imploded after 19 months, and public rumors of adultery and fraud. Joseph also hired private investigators to follow Nora, and the gossip columns loved it.
She was being attacked as a woman who wanted a divorce. She was having her character, slandered, essentially. And so this is obviously very speculative, but it seems particularly spiteful that her music would be stolen. There's that sense in which she is a collector, and I wonder if that's to her detriment, in that she collects so much about other people's lives, but there wasn't really anyone to collect in terms of her life. We're left with these fragments, and as you can hear, I'm as a historian trying to piece together these wildly different aspects of her personality.
Nora Holt was talked about as an incredibly talented, prolific composer, but we may never know how complicated or nuanced her music really was. Would she be taught in music classes today if not for what happened? It's possible. Once the music was stolen, she lost some of her vigor for composition.
I think certainly a sense of pain could be associated with not wanting to return and mourning for the work. But I would also say that she was very busy, and she was really someone who could ride on the waves of the moment.
Nora eventually returned to the United States for good and settled in Los Angeles for a while. There, she opened a beauty salon with a Steinway piano, and sometimes she'd perform for people, singing early American folk songs in addition to spirited tunes from her Parisian days.
She does end up teaching music. She kind of enters this phase as a pedagogue. And then I think kind of the advocacy part of her personality comes to the front.
She moves into radio around 1950 and continues especially to champion Black composers. She's able to literally broadcast everything that she was writing about, back in the 1910s and 20s.
These musicians are proud to offer their gifts to help carry on the commendable program of WNYC, organized to expand the musical culture of the city and provide broadcasting opportunities to young artists and composers.
She didn't want Black musicians and Black composers to be this novelty act. She believed that their art, their music, should just exist on its own terms at the same level as any other musician.
Nora Holt died in 1974, just short of 90 years old. The obituary in the Amsterdam News read, "Fabulous is the word from Mrs. Nora Douglas Holt." So Nora had all these different versions of herself through all these lives and different places where she reinvented herself. Through all of that, are there elements of her as a person and as a composer or musician that stayed constant? Like, do we know of anything that Nora Holt was at her core consistently?
Wow, what a great question. She was not going to conform. As a Black American woman in the early part of the 20th century, she was aware of the social structure that she was supposed to exist in, but she did not conform to that structure. She created her own circle, her own network. I think it allowed her to have some sense of freedom and safety. And Samantha Egga thought that this idea of community started in her earliest days in Kansas City.
Clearly, it really shaped who she was, because despite these varying identities, she always retained that sense of being community-oriented, of uplifting other Black creatives, intellectuals, practitioners, etc., which is something that she would have absorbed and witnessed during her time in Kansas City. So even though it's not necessarily something that she appears to talk about, those experiences remain deeply embedded in who she is.
I guess my final question here, Sam, is do we think her music is still out there? Like, do you have hope?
I'm hopeful, and people I've talked to are hopeful.
I think that certain works could be out there. Someone might have a box from their great-grandparents that contains some of Nora Holt's scores, because things do turn up that way.
Just 15 years ago, in fact, a bunch of handwritten manuscripts of Florence Price, a contemporary of Nora Holt, were found in an abandoned house. Scholars thought they had been lost forever, but there they were, in Illinois.
I don't want to rule things out for Nora Holt. I think it's actually good if we can stay hopeful.
And I guess the best case scenario is that you find this missing music, and it's the key to kind of figuring out like the last piece of the Nora Holt puzzle.
We would certainly learn a lot about her if we could perform and listen to her music.
I think that is very thematic with the stories of Black women. There's always this sense of what could have been, you know, whether it's stolen music or stolen opportunities in general. But I also think that she made her mark in so many other ways. She's continually reinventing herself. But what's really interesting, though, is that she's not necessarily trying to escape the past.
A People's History of Kansas City was reported this month by Sam Wisman and produced by Olivia Hewitt and me, Mackenzie Martin. Editing by Luke Martin and Suzanne Hogan, mixed by Olivia Hewitt and me. Special thanks this episode to Samantha Ege, Lucy Kaplan, and 91.9 Classical KC, my favorite 24/7 classical music station. You heard music from Frédéric Chopin, the Fisk Jubilee Singers, Benny Moten's Kansas City Orchestra, Florence Price, Trixie Smith, Josephine Baker, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Fats Waller, George Gershwin, Fred Melee, Nora Holt, and Blue Dot Sessions. Additional sound from WNIC Archive Collections, Cleveland Public Schools, Poet Speak, Ruben Villar, and WILL, Illinois Public Media. We are a production of KCUR Studios, a podcast network in Kansas City, Missouri, and we will be back in January with a story about a Kansas City saleswoman who went a little rogue and helped marry two of our favorite things together forever. Until then, I'm Mackenzie Martin. From all of us here, we hope you have a really great holiday season and end to this year. Thank you so much for listening.